Salvete amici, welcome back to the channel, or if you're new here, hi. My name is Sabrina and I am a first year classicist at the University of Oxford. If you're interested in the classics application process, or maybe just want an insight into Oxford life, feel free to hit the subscribe button and join me on my university journey. This week's video is a follow-up on the advice video I made 2 weeks ago, which was on the CAT test, which is the Oxford aptitude test for classics as part of the application process. And I will be focusing this week on trying to help you guys prepare for the interviews, which I know is still a while away, but can never hurt to start early, can it? And also to try and give you some last minute guidance on what written work to send in, which I know the deadline's in 3 days. I think it's on Monday. I think it's the 10th of November. But every little helps, right? However, the main part of the video will be focusing on how to prep for interviews. The first bit being tips for what you can do, and the second bit being my experience of interviews, what they were like, how they went, what I wish I'd known. Also, apologies if it's really loud in here. I don't know what the audio quality will be like because I haven't filmed in this room before. This is the joint study that I normally share with my roommate, but she isn't here at the moment, so I thought, you know what, I'll just give it a go in here instead of sitting in the floor in my bedroom. But if the noise quality is really bad, then I'll know for next time to just move it back into my room. Mainly it's because the windows they're not double glazed, and so you can hear pretty much everything from the street. And also, for some reason, the radiators in this room are so loud. Like, even when they're turned off right now, I still feel like they're making quite a lot of noise. So I don't know if that will pick up on the camera, but if it does, apologies. Also, I will put timestamps in the description so you can skip to the most relevant parts of the video, but you know, I'd still say it's pretty good to watch the whole thing just so you know you can get the most out of my advice. Okay, so let's quickly discuss written work. The deadline for submitting written work is the 10th of November, which is 3 days time, so you really don't have a lot of time left if you haven't thought about doing it yet. But I'm pretty sure most of you will be super proactive and probably more organised than I was last year, and you're already on it. That's brilliant. But for those of you who still are like, I don't know what to send, I'll quickly try and give you an idea. So I submitted I submitted two of my practice essays for my classical civilization A level. I did, what was it? Homer's use of speeches is his most effective method of characterization. Evaluate the statement, which was for the Iliad side of classics. And when did democracy start in Athens, which was for the democracy side of classics that we were studying at the time. So that's just an indication of the kind of essays that I submitted. I mean, they say, like, I think maximum 2,000 words is what they want, right? I probably should have double checked that, but I'm not sure. But basically just like a normal school essay that you would submit, but preferably try and make it a good one that you did well on. And it needs to show your teacher's feedback on it as well. That's another key point. So preferably, I think they preferably want it handwritten and then for you to scan it in. And also, very importantly, you need to make sure that you've filled out these written cover worksheets with all your details on, because like you also need to get your teacher to sign off on them, and you need to get your school to stamp before you can even submit it. So you don't want to leave that to the last minute, because that will be very stressful if your teachers aren't there on that day or some other mishap happens. But in general, I think the written work section of the application process is pretty self-explanatory. I mean, I do remember panicking a little bit about like, oh, what should I send because I don't like any of my essays or whatever, but honestly, I don't think it's that deep. Just try and pick 2 essays that you think you did okay in, and then fill out the forms, scan them in, and send them off by Monday. Okay, so now swiftly moving on to the interview prep advice bit of this video. I'll just quickly give you a rundown of what interviews will be like this year, just for the key information, so if you're not aware of it, you are now made aware. If everything goes to plan, and it should do, you've submitted all your written work, you've done the test, you've sent off your personal statement and all your grades, then you should be getting an interview in December. And especially for classics, considering, like I said before, 96% of the applicants do get an interview. So interviews this year will be looking a little bit different, because they will be online over some sort of online program like Zoom or Microsoft Teams, or however else Oxford is deciding to organise it. They'll probably inform you when you get your interview. From what I've seen online, all interviews are expected to follow a subject-specific timetable, and they've also said that it's very likely that you'll probably get multiple interviews at multiple colleges, even though it's online. But A good thing about that, at least this year, is that you are told that you will be given 24 hours notice before you get any new interviews, which is slightly less stressful than when you're here actually in person for interview, because they could literally just call you any time for an interview in like an hour or 2 hours time. And I had that as a very stressful experience, but I'll go into that a bit later in the actual my experience of the interview section. So I have here that most of the classics interviews, the pre-organised ones, will take place between the 7th and the 10th of December, and if you have additional interviews at other colleges, you'll be notified by 2 p.m. on Friday the 17th of December, and these additional ones will take place between Monday the 14th of December and Wednesday the 16th of December. So all in all, a pretty drawn out process in comparison to if you were here for maybe a few days or a week. You'd have them all lumped together, and obviously now it could go over 2 weeks, which, you know, isn't necessarily ideal. You'll probably get notified for interviews at the end of November, beginning of December. I think I got notified a week perhaps or 2 weeks before I had my interview, so I went around the 10th of December and I think I got notified on the 2nd of December, so give it roughly a week before and that's roughly when you'll find out. Okay, so now moving on to actual tips of how to prep for these interviews, these online scary interviews. Tip number 1. Get comfortable with uncomfortable silences. This might sound a bit weird, but let me explain. During your interviewers will usually ask you questions and then just sit there in silence staring at you until you come up with something to say before they even try and give you another hint to move on to the next bit. In addition, you will have at least 2 interviewers and sometimes more. In one of my interviews I had at least 3, and it would have been 4 if one of them hadn't had to leave early. So that's quite a daunting prospect to have so many people in a room just looking at you, and these are like senior academics as well. So you need to get used to the idea that you will have one person questioning you and like looking at you directly, and the other person usually will stay silent and be just taking notes about everything you say, and then they might switch halfway through. They might switch roles, so the other person will ask you questions and then the other person will take notes. I personally think this is one of the biggest challenges of Oxford interviews, because particularly for state school students, most students come from schools where the classes are very big and they're not used to having the full focal attention on them for over 5 minutes, and now you have to sit there, what, for 20 minutes, and all the attention is on you and what you're saying. I was quite an unusual case for a state school student because I had quite a lot of experience in this kind of teaching and learning because of the fact that I'd taken Latin, and in my Latin class in sixth form there was 4 of us in year 12 and then it went down to 2 of us in year 13, which basically meant that we were being taught in this interview style and the Oxford tutorial style constantly. However, I appreciate the fact that this is not the case for most people, particularly state school students. So if you haven't practiced interview organised for you, and hopefully you do, if you have a school that will try and find someone to teach you, try and replicate the conditions that the interviews will be given to you in December in. So by that I mean have it online, have it on Zoom or on Microsoft Teams, and then have at least 2 people in that call with you. One of them can just be silent there and just taking notes, but you need to get used to the pressure of having 2 people just watching you and analysing you so that you don't get thrown off and psyched out during the real thing, because I think that is one of the biggest letdowns of why, well, that's one of the biggest things that really impacts state school students' performance in interviews. Tip number 2. If you did one of the languages at A-level, make sure that your language skills are on point, and in particular, revise your grammar. In interviews, you might find yourself being given a piece of unseen Greek or Latin, depending on what the interview is. I had at least 2 interviews which included that, and 1 interview where the focus was majorly on grammar specifics being tested on constructions and things, and the guy would ask me like, why is the subjunctive being used here? And it was sort of like a yes or no situation. So if you did the language at A-level, brush up on your grammar. Tip number 3. Go through your personal statement and highlight anything that you could possibly be asked about for an interview, and then revise it. Make a sort of revision list. Like, I kind of made a revision list here of everything that I needed to cover, and then also when you're revising, try and like make or think of points to make about that thing that you've been revising, because the last thing you want to do is to be tripped up in an interview. You're being asked by a world expert in their subject about something quite niche within something you've mentioned, and then you're just there like, I don't know, I didn't think about it. Like, that's not going to be helpful. The questions that interviewers tend to ask you about your personal statement will be the more in-depth and detailed questions, because they're really trying to see how deep your knowledge is in that particular area, and they're really trying to test your thinking. So the questions might be very specific, and that's why it's good to try and predict what they might possibly ask you about a certain subject that you've mentioned. Okay, so now I'll move on to the section where I discuss my experience of interviews last year in December. I can't believe it was a whole year ago. That's crazy. Like, I still remember it like it was yesterday. And I was quite an extreme case, because I ended up having 5 interviews at 3 different colleges, 2 at the college which was my first choice, where I was originally pulled, and where I am now, so that was pretty good. 2 at Somerville College, and 1 very, very last minute stressful one at St Anne's, which was straight after my 2 at Somerville. Ones that I did at my college, the first one was a mixture between literature and ancient history, and then the second one was focusing on language and philosophy as like a combined interview. My first interview at Somerville was a pure language one, and by language I mean Latin. It was just focusing completely on Latin grammar and Latin translation, and how well I dealt with an unseen poem. And the second one was a pure philosophy one, which was my worst one, and it was not enjoyable at all, partly because I didn't really know what I was doing. I'd never done philosophy before, and it was just very stressful. And my last minute interview at St Anne's was just a mix of everything, and it was just kind of crazy, because I got given like a bit of Latin literature to analyse in both the language and like the English bit, asked for some philosophy questions, and also asked the sort of dreaded questions of like, why do you want to study classics at Oxford, and how are you as a student, what would you do in this scenario if you had a problem, and those sort of more psychological questions, I guess. All of my interviews, I got 20 minutes of pre-reading before the actual thing began, where I got given a piece of unseen text, similar to like if you were in an exam, get given an unseen text or an unseen article, which I kind of needed to read through, highlight, annotate, try and think of points and what they could possibly ask you about, and actually try and understand what the article was saying. So for my first interview, which was a combination between ancient literature and ancient history, also sorry, I've got my notes on my phone because I don't want to get things wrong. Basically, I got given an unseen poem. Well, for me it was unseen. It was a poem by Sappho, which they didn't tell you that it was Sappho, but I managed to work it out because I'd listened to some podcasts and I figured that it was Sappho. And because I was 1B, which means I hadn't done Greek at A-level, they didn't give it to me in the Greek, they just gave it to me in the English. But I think they gave it to the people who did Greek, they gave it to them in Greek as well as in the English, which is kind of what later ended up happening to me when I was doing my interview at St Anne's, where I got given a piece of Virgil, which was both in Latin and English. They will literally just ask you to talk about what you find interesting in the poem and then go off of your ideas. So it's very much a case of, when you get the bit of unseen in that 20 minutes, also when you're reading it, trying to think of like, ooh, what is a good talking point that I could use here, what's like interesting to discuss. Then about halfway through my first interview, they decided to ask me about a subject that I was really interested in with classics that I hadn't necessarily mentioned all that much on my personal statement, and I decided to talk about my EPQ because like I said that I'd done it on my personal statement, but I hadn't actually elaborated that much on it. So we just ended up discussing the roles of women in Roman religion, and then from that it kind of, as things do, spiraled onto loads of different random topics to do with women's power and position within the Roman Empire. So that's an example of why doing extra reading outside of even your personal statement might be a useful thing. My second interview was the combined interview of philosophy and language, and here I got given, for my 20 minutes pre-reading, an article on the philosophy of metaphors and similes and their use, which I found very difficult because the sort of questions that were being asked were, what is a metaphor? Is something more of a metaphor than something else? Like, obviously something being a specific example. If I say I analyze a building, does it mean the same thing as I demolish a building if the words are from the same root? And then there was also another question about like, if I have a new language and I have no idea what this specific word is, how do I go about deriving what the meaning of this potential word could be? I think there was also a final question of like, why do we need metaphors? Obviously these questions are very philosophical and out there and not something that you necessarily prepare for, but it's just good to be aware that these are the sort of things they might ask. And there was also a random 5-10 minutes towards the end when the other interviewer switched roles with the first person and started asking me about why we should still study classics, why is it still relevant to today, what can we learn about the past. So good thing to prep for the interviews is those sort of questions that are kind of a little bit predictable, where it's like, oh, why do you want to study classics, why do you want to study Oxford, why did you pick this college? Because I think they're very likely to come up. My third interview was my Latin language interview at Somerville, where I got given an unseen poem by a random author. I can't even remember what it was, sort of telling a myth, I think, from what I can remember. And it was very much a case of, they gave me the Latin and the English, but they expect you to analyse the poem through both means. So obviously using the translation to try and help you, and also your like obvious vocab knowledge, because the guy was asking me questions on like, is there anything wrong with this translation, like how could we make this translation better? Also asking me specific grammar questions like, why is a subjunctive used here, what is this construction? And it was very much a yes you're right, no you're wrong kind of a situation with that interview, which was a bit different to the others, because the others you don't really know how you're doing, and this one it was like, it was very clear if you're doing it all right or not. Interview 4 was the worst one, and that was the worst one by far. It was the pure philosophy interview at Somerville. And so while they don't expect you to know any philosophy when you're applying to Oxford, they still test you with philosophy, because it is, you know, it's going to be part of my course and I'm already scared for it, but you know, that's a whole different story. And the questions I got given, I got given a piece of an article taken off like JSTOR or something, which was discussing simulation machines and the morality surrounding simulation machines. And I'm gonna be honest, I did not really understand it at all, because I was sitting there 20 minutes just reading this like convoluted language and just feeling completely out of my depth. So that's the one interview that I felt really nervous for, because I didn't really know what I was saying, I didn't really understand the text. The guy somehow linked simulation machines and the morality around simulation machines to animal rights and why we shouldn't kill animals, but we never got that far because I was so confused. So that was bad. I just felt really bad because I felt like I was stuck on like the easy things. And at one point the woman did actually ask me if I needed to if she needed to open the window, so presumably I either looked very pale or very red. I can't tell what it was, but that was not a good indication of how it went. But within that interview as well, I think they kind of, in the end, they just ended up giving up trying to like talk to me about this thing, and they started asking me other questions, more philosophical questions about why I think humans are scared of death, and also my previous knowledge of philosophy. So we briefly discussed Plato's Symposium, because that's the only thing I really knew, and I think they were surprised that I even knew about it, because I obviously did so terrible in the first bit. But at least this story shows that one bad interview does not define your whole application, because otherwise I would not have got in. And just my luck, when I came out of this awful 4th interview at Somerville, the philosophy one, and I was just feeling so down and depressed, I was like, I feel so stupid, like I've ruined it, this is awful. I get a phone call from the helpers at my college being like, oh, so you know, we're just making sure you're on your way to your next interview. I was just there like, excuse me? I have not been told about any interview. It is 5:30, it is late. Like, you said that no interviews were going past probably 5 o'clock. And they'd scheduled this really last minute interview at St Anne's for me, which they hadn't told me about, so I'd already actually missed at the beginning, but luckily they pushed it back for 6 o'clock. So I had to like rush, after walking all the way back to my college, I had to rush all the way back past Somerville to get to St Anne's and go to this interview and do my pre-reading, and I was just not in the mindset for it. I was like, oh my god, how can I do another interview? I've just done two in a row and now I have to do another one. But luckily this one went a bit better than the last one, mainly because it was not all philosophy. I got given a extract from Virgil's Georgics, which was talking about bees and ants and why he likes them so much, and like making comparisons between them and the Roman Republic. I also got given the English for that and the Latin, and it was sort of like a case of you get an unseen, you have to try and analyse it and like find points to talk about, just like I did before with the Aeneid in A-level. However, the scary thing about that 5th interview was that not only when I walked in was there 3 people sitting across the table from me facing me down, and there would have been 4 if the guy hadn't had to leave because of this whole mess of the fact that the interview was so late in the evening and he had left. I would have had 4 people staring me down, so I'm kind of glad in the end that it was only 3. But the fact that the guy asked me to just keep talking until I either run out of things to say or they asked me to stop, like, that's so scary, that's so much pressure. So yeah, just so you're aware, like, that can be a thing that they might ask you to do. After the literature part of the interview, another interviewer took over and he started asking me ethics questions surrounding self-driving cars, and if all lives are equal, is it right to kill a stranger over a family member or an enemy over a loved one? And we were discussing things in that kind of realm. And I think we also briefly touched on Plato's Symposium, because they asked me like what was my experience with philosophy. That's the only thing I could think of. And then finally after that, the other interviewer who hadn't spoken yet, she started asking me more questions about me as a student, and obviously like why I wanted to study classics, what do I think I can get out of classics, why do I think I'm suited to Oxford, and also like how do I cope with stress and what my particular interests in classics are. So they were more the sort of questions that you can predict a little bit when you're prepping for interview. Sort of expect that at some point probably you might be asked about, you know, almost as if you hadn't written a whole personal statement about why you want to do classics. They're going to ask you again, why do you want to do classics? Why is it relevant? Why do you think you would be a good student at Oxford? That whole sham. So just be aware and be smart by trying to at least plan out your answers for that a little bit. Okay, so I think that rounds up this week's video. I know it was super long-winded and I have a very strong tendency to ramble, so I apologise for that, but hopefully it was all useful for you guys, particularly for those of you who are actually applying this year, but any future prospective students. I hope that gives you an insight into what interviews might be like and how to prep for them. Remember to send off your work on by the 10th of November, otherwise you'll get kicked out of the application process. So remember to do that. Also, if you are a classic applicant this year, please leave a comment down below and tell me how you think the CAT went. Are you excited for the interviews? How do you feel about them being online? I'd love to know, I'd love to hear your thoughts. But now I need to go and actually start working, and we'll go back to working on my essay for this week. The 5th week blues truly do be hitting at some point, which is about Hector and Patroclus in the Iliad. So the grind never stops. But I'll see you next week, or maybe the week after, depending on the Oxford workload, honestly. But I hope you all have a lovely rest of the day and see you soon. Bye.